The first time you heard that song, you probably didn't think much of it. Maybe it felt unremarkable, or slightly off, or simply forgettable. But then it played again, and again, and at some point, without any conscious decision on your part, you started to like it. You might have even told someone it was one of your favorites. Nothing about the song changed, but something about your relationship to it did. And that shift, quiet and automatic and almost completely invisible, happens to you constantly in ways that go far beyond music. Psychologists call it the mere exposure effect, and it is one of the most replicated findings in the history of social psychology. The principle is straightforward. Repeated exposure to a stimulus, with no other information provided, increases how much a person likes it. You don't need a reason. You don't need a good experience associated with it. Familiarity alone is enough to generate preference. The more you encounter something, the more positively you tend to evaluate it. And crucially, you almost never notice this is happening. The research originated in the 1960s with psychologist Robert Zajonc, who set out to investigate whether preference could exist entirely without awareness. In a series of experiments, he exposed participants to stimuli they had never seen before: Chinese characters, abstract shapes, photographs of strangers. Some stimuli were shown many times. Others appeared only once or twice. Participants were then asked to rate how much they liked each item and to guess whether each one had been shown frequently or rarely. The results were consistent and striking. Items shown more often were rated as more likable, more pleasant, more appealing. And the participants had no reliable memory of having seen them before. The preference was real. The conscious awareness of its source was completely absent. This matters for reasons that extend well beyond experiments with abstract shapes. The mere exposure effect operates everywhere you carry a brain. It shapes your musical taste, your aesthetic preferences, your political beliefs, and your social judgments. It influences which ideas feel reasonable and which feel radical. It affects how attractive you find people, including yourself. It quietly organizes much of what you experience as personal taste, deeply held opinion, and authentic preference, without your knowledge or your consent. Consider how this works in social life. Research shows that people who are seen more frequently are rated as more likable, more trustworthy, more competent, even when the viewers know nothing specific about them. The colleague you pass in the hallway every morning builds a different standing in your perception than an equally competent colleague you rarely encounter. The person whose name appears in your feed repeatedly feels more familiar, and familiarity gets unconsciously translated into warmth and trust. You're not choosing to trust them more. Your brain is doing it based on frequency of contact alone, with no evaluation required. The effect also has a significant relationship with fear and anxiety. Zajonc found that repeated exposure to previously unfamiliar or mildly threatening stimuli tends to reduce the negative response over time. What once triggered wariness begins to feel ordinary. This is part of why exposure therapy works in treating phobias. Controlled, repeated contact with the feared object gradually shifts the emotional register from alarm to neutrality. The brain's threat response is calibrated not only by the nature of a stimulus, but by its perceived familiarity. Known things feel safer, as a default, than unknown things do. This instinct likely has evolutionary roots. In an ancestral environment, familiar things were things that had not yet killed you. The unfamiliar carried genuine risk. An organism calibrated to prefer the familiar over the novel would make safer choices on average. The cognitive shortcut that equates familiarity with safety was useful and may have been essential for survival. In the modern world, that same shortcut continues operating in every domain, including ones where familiarity has no meaningful relationship to safety, quality, or truth. One of the more unsettling implications of the mere exposure effect is what it suggests about the formation of beliefs. Ideas that appear frequently feel more valid, not because their content has been evaluated and found sound, but because repeated exposure generates a sense of fluency and recognition that the brain interprets as truth. Researchers call this the illusory truth effect, a close cousin of mere exposure. Statements that have been heard before are rated as more accurate than novel statements, regardless of whether they are actually true. The feeling of familiarity mimics the feeling of knowledge, and it is very difficult, even for critical thinkers, to separate the two reliably. This has direct consequences for how information spreads and why repetition is so effective as a persuasion strategy. When a claim is repeated often enough, it stops feeling like a claim and starts feeling like background fact. You don't evaluate it the same way you would evaluate something heard for the first time. The cognitive work of skepticism requires treating the familiar as if it were new, which demands a deliberate and effortful override of a very efficient default system. The effect also distorts self-perception in ways that are rarely discussed. Your face is one of the most familiar images you ever encounter, but only in mirror form. Other people see your face in its natural orientation. You see it reversed. Research shows that people tend to prefer their mirror image over photographs of themselves, while others prefer the photographs. What you have been most exposed to is what you find most comfortable and natural looking, even when it comes to your own appearance. Your preference for your own reflection is, in part, simply a preference for the familiar version. Understanding the mere exposure effect doesn't neutralize it. Knowing that repeated exposure shapes your preferences doesn't mean your preferences were therefore wrong, or that familiarity is always a poor guide. Familiarity can genuinely signal accumulated positive experience. The song you've heard 100 times may have provided real comfort across 100 different moments. The person you see every day may have earned your trust through consistent behavior. Familiarity and quality often travel together. The problem is that the brain doesn't distinguish between them. It treats the signal of familiarity as evidence of value, whether or not value is actually present. What awareness does allow is a different kind of question. When you find yourself drawn to something, when an idea feels obviously true, when a person seems immediately trustworthy, when a choice feels obviously right, it is worth asking what role mere exposure may be playing. Not to dismiss the feeling, but to check whether familiarity is doing work that actual evidence or reflection should be doing instead. The preference is real. What's pointing to may not be what you think.